Hello friends and welcome back to Zhen Guandian. I'm Zhen Fei. The Iran war is drawing to a close and the next major event we can foresee is whether the United States will withdraw from NATO. This isn't the first time Trump has made such a tough threat, but this time the situation is entirely different. Because even the most steadfast NATO supporter within the Republican Party, Secretary of State Rubio, has publicly stated that the value of NATO needs to be re-examined.
And I was one of the strongest defenders of NATO during my time as a United States Senator because I found great value in it. And it wasn't just about defending Europe. I said it also allowed us to have military bases in Europe, which enabled us to project power into different parts of the world when our national security was threatened. If now we've reached a point where the NATO alliance means that we can't use those bases, that in fact we can no longer use those bases to defend America's interests, then NATO is a one-way street. Then NATO is simply about us having troops in Europe to defend Europe. But when we need their help, not their help, we're not asking them to conduct airstrikes. When we need them to allow us to use their military bases, their answer is no. Then why are we in NATO? You have to ask that question. Why do we have billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars over the years, trillions of dollars, and all these American forces stationed in the region? If we can only use, we in our time of need, we're not going to be allowed to use those bases. So I think there's no doubt. Fortunately, after this conflict is concluded, we are going to have to re-examine that relationship. We're going to have to re-examine the value of NATO and that alliance for our country. Ultimately, that's a decision for the president to make.
It was Rubio himself who pushed for the bill prohibiting the president from withdrawing from NATO. 3 years later, he is now questioning the very foundation of NATO's existence, which shows that the seriousness of this matter has far surpassed mere political posturing. Last week, NATO Secretary General Rutte urgently flew to Washington to meet with Trump. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, and afterwards Rutte only said 4 words, clearly disappointed. He was very disappointed. Yesterday, Trump posted, "We spend hundreds of billions of dollars on NATO every year, but they don't help us. What's the point?" The new German Chancellor, Merz, put it even more bluntly, the Iran war has already become a transatlantic stress test. The flashpoint is the Strait of Hormuz. After the outbreak of the Iran war, the Strait of Hormuz has always been a key variable affecting the course of the conflict. Precisely because of this, Trump demanded that NATO allies join in. However, not a single ally took action. Now that the Strait of Hormuz is reopened, these NATO allies are all saying they want to defend the freedom of navigation through the strait. Trump's reaction is entirely predictable. NATO involves 32 countries and is a military alliance that has lasted for 77 years. Since the Cold War, it has been the cornerstone of the entire Western security order. Now, however, it is facing the most serious crisis since its inception. If this crisis ultimately shakes things up, it won't just be a military organisation that's affected, but the Western world order established over the past century or more. This is a major signal of a global power realignment. In our previous 2 episodes, we also discussed 4 major events in a single week, which actually foreshadow the reshuffling of the entire Western civilization. So, we are now at a moment of historic upheaval. Subscribe to Zhen Guandian and let's keep up with current affairs together. Today's episode is full of stories and I'm sure you'll all thoroughly enjoy it, so make sure you watch until the very end. At Zhen Guandian, we cover the stories behind the news, specialising in explaining major events in just 20 minutes. If you enjoy this, please give us a like, subscribe to Zhen Guandian and comment with topics you want to see next. So friends, every interaction from you helps my programme trigger YouTube's recommendation algorithm, allowing my voice to reach more people. I'd like to thank you all in advance. Now, to understand the crisis NATO is currently facing, we first need to go back to Berlin in 1948. On the 24th of June that year, the Soviet Union did something. They cut off all the roads leading to West Berlin. Rail and waterways were also cut off overnight, turning the whole of West Berlin into an isolated island. Picture this, 2.5 million people trapped in a city, surrounded entirely by Soviet troops. The food supplies would only last a few weeks, there was no coal, no electricity, and nothing could be brought in. At that time, the Western world faced only 3 options. The first option was to go to war, to send tanks crashing through the Soviet blockade, but that could well have meant the start of World War III. The second was to back down and simply hand West Berlin over to the Soviets. The third was to take a route that everyone thought was impossible, to supply the city from the air. The United States chose the third option, and what happened next was nothing short of a miracle in the history of human logistics. The United States and Britain launched an airlift operation known as Operation Victuals. Over the course of nearly a year and a half, they flew almost 280,000 sorties in total, delivering more than 2.3 million tons of supplies into West Berlin. This included coal, flour, powdered milk and medicines, all dropped in from the sky. At the peak of the operation, a plane was landing at Berlin Airport every 45 seconds. One every 45 seconds! You can get a sense of just how dense that was. There's also a little story here. At the time, there was an American pilot named Halverson. One day, after completing his mission, he was resting by the airport fence when he saw a group of Berlin children standing outside. He noticed something rather odd. In other occupied cities, whenever children saw American soldiers, they would always reach out for sweets or chocolate, but these Berlin children didn't ask for anything at all. They simply stood there quietly, watching him. Halverson was deeply moved, so he broke the only 2 sticks of chewing gum he had in his pocket into pieces and shared them with the children. The children, for their part, carefully tore the sweet wrappers into thin strips and took turns smelling a scent. The next day, Halverson made a decision. He fashioned a few small parachutes out of handkerchiefs, tied sweets to them, and dropped them from his plane for the children. Soon, other American pilots began to do the same, and the children of Berlin gave them a nickname, the Candy Bombers. Why tell this story? Because it encapsulates the emotions of an era, the Western world's fear of Soviet expansion, and the determination shown by the United States at that moment. It was precisely this combination of collective Western fear and determination that gave rise to NATO. On 4th April 1949, while the Berlin blockade had not yet been fully lifted, 12 countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, thus establishing NATO. That is how it came into being. At its core, it is actually Article 5, an armed attack against any member state. It would be regarded as an attack against all member states. To put it plainly, if you attack my brother, you're attacking me. However, there's a fact here that many people don't know. When the United States first joined NATO, it actually had no intention of staying in it permanently. President Truman and later President Eisenhower both believed that America's military presence in Europe was only temporary. Eisenhower had a very clear idea. The United States would first help Europe get back on its feet, and once Europe was capable of dealing with the Soviet Union on its own, America would withdraw. In other words, from the very beginning, the United States saw itself as a temporary worker for NATO. But this temporary worker role has lasted for 77 years. And not only has Europe failed to stand on its own, it has actually become increasingly dependent on America. Under America's long-term protection, Europe used the money it saved on defence spending to build its own welfare system, things like free healthcare, extra long holidays, early retirement, and so on. American taxpayers are standing guard for Europeans, while Europeans use the money they've saved, well, to go on holiday. This was a seed planted from the very first day NATO was founded, a seed of imbalance. And over the next 77 years, this seed would repeatedly sprout and repeatedly trigger crises. The first crisis, caused by this seed, occurred just 7 years after NATO was established, and the fuse that set it off happened to be a straight as well. In 1956, a man named Nasser became president of Egypt. This man was extremely ambitious. He wanted to nationalise the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is an artificial waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. Almost all the oil transported from the Middle East to Europe passed through here, especially in those days. Whoever controlled the Suez Canal effectively held Europe's energy lifeline in their hands, and the operation of this canal had long been in the hands of companies controlled by Britain and France. So Egypt's President Nasser said, "Hey, this canal is on our Egyptian territory, so why should we let foreigners make money from it?" So he planned to take it back, but to the British Prime Minister, this was simply unacceptable. He believed that Nasser was just like Hitler back in the day. Today he takes the canal, tomorrow he'll want the whole Middle East, so action must be taken to stop him. The French felt the same way. At the time, the French Prime Minister Mollet was even more anxious than the British, because not only had Nasser taken the canal, he was also secretly supporting the independence movement in Algeria, a French colony, which directly threatened French interests. So the British and French exchanged knowing glances. They were getting ready to intervene, but the problem was, openly sending troops to attack a newly independent third world country would never pass muster in the eyes of international public opinion. So what could they do? They decided to incite Israel. There was deep-seated hatred between Israel and Egypt. On the very next day after Israel was founded in 1948, Egypt, together with Syria, Jordan, Iraq and other Arab countries, sent troops to invade Israel. By the 1950s, Egyptian President Nasser was constantly supporting armed attacks against Israel. Israel absolutely loathed Nasser and had long been looking for an opportunity to deal with him. So, in October 1956, in a villa on the outskirts of Paris, representatives from Britain, France and Israel secretly signed an agreement known as the Protocol of Sèvres. Their plan was to have Israel invade Egypt's Sinai Peninsula first, advancing to the vicinity of the Suez Canal. Then Britain and France would pretend to intervene as peacekeepers. And finally, under the pretext of peacekeeping, they would send in troops and justifiably take control of the canal. The key to this plan was that the three NATO allies kept it secret from the United States, secretly plotting a war behind the back of NATO's leader. On the 29th of October, Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula according to the plan. Britain and France then issued what they called an ultimatum, demanding both sides ceasefire, and then sent in troops. 6 days later, British paratroopers landed at Port Said by the canal. Very soon, US President Eisenhower discovered the truth through CIA intelligence. He was furious, firstly because his pride had taken a hit. At that time, the Soviet Union was simultaneously suppressing a popular uprising in Hungary. The United States had only just condemned the Soviet Union's atrocities, and then, turning around, discovered that its own allies were also using force against a small country. In the words of then Vice President Nixon, we cannot condemn the Soviet Union for interfering in Hungary while at the same time tacitly allowing our allies, Britain and France, to invade Egypt. Furthermore, Eisenhower was also well aware that if the Western powers attacked a third world country, the entire Arab world would be pushed towards the Soviet side, which would be extremely disadvantageous in the struggle against the Soviets. Another, and perhaps the most terrifying reason, was that the Soviet Union threatened to use nuclear weapons. Khrushchev publicly warned at the time that if Britain and France did not withdraw their troops, the Soviet Union would launch rocket attacks on London and Paris. Eisenhower also urgently ordered U-2 reconnaissance planes to fly over Syria to check whether the Soviets had actually deployed their air force there. At the time, the Pentagon even received orders to prepare for a possible Third World War. It was against this backdrop that the United States made a decision that the British still find hard to accept to this day, to side with the Soviet Union. Opposing its NATO allies, the US condemned the British and French military actions. Eisenhower went further, imposing economic sanctions. Washington refused to prop up the pound, causing it to crash. British reserves plummeted within days. Britain resisted for 2 days before buckling under pressure and accepting the ceasefire. They withdrew from Egypt with their tails between their legs. The Suez Canal crisis was the first internal shock in NATO's history, and trust between the allies was torn apart at this moment. The most far-reaching impact of this crisis was that Britain and France drew completely opposite lessons from it. Britain, from then on, recognised the reality. Without American support, Britain could achieve nothing. And what about France? France, on the other hand, drew a completely different conclusion, since at a critical moment the United States not only refused to help but even undermined me. Why should I continue to listen to you? From that point onwards, France began to vigorously develop its own independent nuclear capability, pursuing this path with determination. This then directly triggered NATO's second near-death crisis. And what happened after the crisis? France's anger only grew stronger and stronger. The person who truly transformed this fury into action was Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle was the leader of the French resistance during the Second World War, a national hero of the French people, and the founder of the Fifth French Republic. This man had a very strong conviction that France is a great nation and must not play second fiddle to anyone. Including the lesson of the Suez Crisis with the United States, this convinced de Gaulle that when all is said and done, collective defence under NATO was ultimately dictated by America. With French troops placed under NATO's command structure, at a critical moment they wouldn't even be able to fight their own battles and would have to look to America for approval. For him, this was unacceptable. In 1960, France successfully tested its first atomic bomb. With its own nuclear weapons, France's national defence was no longer entirely reliant on America's protective umbrella. By the mid-1960s, France had already developed nuclear strike capabilities, including land-based missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and airdrop nuclear bombs. De Gaulle's logic was that since we now have nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union wouldn't dare attack us. If even the Soviets wouldn't dare attack us, then why should we remain in NATO? What was the point? So, step by step, he began to take action, starting by withdrawing France's Mediterranean fleet from NATO's command structure. Then he refused to allow other countries' nuclear weapons to be stored on French territory. In 1963, when the United States proposed a plan for NATO member states to jointly manage a nuclear fleet, de Gaulle flatly refused. But all of this was merely a prelude. The real rupture occurred on the 7th of March 1966. On that day, de Gaulle personally wrote a letter to the then President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson. And what was in this letter? Put simply, it stated that France would withdraw from NATO's integrated military command structure and that all foreign troops and military facilities not under French command must leave French territory entirely. The letter was delivered to Raymond Leddy, the US Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs at the time, who later recalled that you could easily imagine General de Gaulle writing this letter by hand in his office in Paris. When US President Johnson received this letter, he was furious. He wrote a strongly worded reply warning de Gaulle that this decision would seriously undermine Western security, but de Gaulle didn't care in the slightest. He then went on to announce his own timetable. He stated that by 1st of April 1967, all foreign bases and troops must leave French territory, including 26,000 American and Canadian soldiers. This decision sent shockwaves through the entire Western world, and the Allied nations all tried to persuade de Gaulle to change his mind, but it was to no avail. In the end, NATO's headquarters moved out of Paris, and the Supreme Military Command also relocated. This was the most serious blow NATO had suffered since its founding. A founding member, a nuclear power, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, had openly withdrawn from the military core of the alliance. Everyone said that this time NATO was truly finished. But NATO wasn't finished. Why was that? Because de Gaulle had left a back door open. France withdrew from the military command structure, but it did not actually leave NATO itself. Moreover, the French military and NATO had signed a secret cooperation agreement, stipulating that if the Soviet Union really did take action, the French military would cooperate with NATO in combat. Sure enough, when the Balkan Wars broke out in the 1990s, the French army returned to fight once again, this time under the banner of NATO. In 2009, France officially rejoined NATO, coming back after 43 years away. This was NATO's second resurrection. At this point, friends, have you noticed a pattern? In the first two crises, no matter how fierce the turmoil, there was always one constant premise: they had a common external enemy. The Soviet Union enabled NATO to continue fulfilling its original mission at critical moments, uniting to confront the Soviet Union. But what if one day the Soviet Union disappeared? Could NATO still continue to exist? After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, this question arose. On the 11th of September 2001, terrorists hijacked 4 airliners and crashed them into the United States. In NATO's 77-year history, Article 5, which states that an attack on one is an attack on all, has only ever been triggered once, and that was after 9/11. All of NATO's allies stood up to support the United States, and many countries joined America in fighting in Afghanistan. But 2 years later, when President George W. Bush decided to take action against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the situation was quite different. Many allies were not on board. President Chirac of France, for example, made it clear that he would veto any resolution for military action at the United Nations. The German Chancellor also openly opposed it. The then US Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, made a very famous remark. He referred to Germany and France as old Europe. What he meant was that these old relics could no longer represent the future. Countries like Poland and the Czech Republic, which had newly joined NATO from Eastern Europe, were considered New Europe. What was even more serious was that this division directly paralysed NATO's decision-making mechanism. At the time, Turkey, as a NATO member and a neighbour of Iraq, was facing a potential military threat from Iraq. So Turkey invoked Article 4 of the NATO treaty, requesting the Allies to convene a meeting to discuss how to protect Turkey. However, Belgium, France and Germany all obstructed this, believing that approving defensive deployments for Turkey at this time would be tantamount to giving the green light to America's war by the back door. Meanwhile, the US's operational plan also required passage through northern Turkey so that over 60,000 American troops could enter Iraq from the north, forming a pincer movement with the southern offensive from Kuwait. But at the time, Turkey rejected this plan, didn't they? For a time, the United States had no choice but to change its operational plan. When this news reached home, it sparked a huge backlash in the US. Americans directed their anger at France, which had taken the toughest stance at the time. So, in the US Congress cafeteria, the French fries on the menu, what we called chips, were temporarily renamed Freedom Fries, and French toast became Freedom Toast. In fact, every instance of the word French was changed. All references were removed, and there was also a grassroots movement to boycott French wine and French cheese. At that time, many politicians in the US and around the world were saying that NATO was now just an empty shell with no real purpose, because if I want to go to war and you will not help, then surely NATO is meaningless. In fact, this is very similar to the current situation, but reality soon provided a different answer. Just a few months later, in August 2003, NATO took over command of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. This is the first time in NATO's history that it led a large-scale military operation outside Europe, and it was also the largest overseas deployment at the time. So in the end, NATO did join its big brother, the United States. With the war in Afghanistan and across the entire Middle East, NATO thus experienced its third resurrection. At this point, let's briefly look back. The first three existential crises faced by NATO all had one thing in common. The juniors often caused trouble. First, the secret Suez invasion. Second, France's walkout. Third, the German, French and Turkish defiance. Though the annoyed US always cleaned up, NATO effectively became a US extension. It used to be that they helped the United States, but today things are different. Today it's the United States, the big brother, who wants to leave NATO. The trigger was the Strait of Hormuz. The US needed its allies to send warships to help protect merchant vessels passing through, but not a single NATO ally took action. Now that the Strait of Hormuz has reopened, NATO allies are all stepping forward saying, "Oh, I want to provide an escort." However, this doesn't mean they're joining the United States in its war against Iran. So as the whole situation unfolded, Trump became quite displeased. The United States doesn't actually need the Strait of Hormuz that much. It's really Asia that needs it, and it's Europe that needs peace in the Middle East. The US has already put in so much effort. These European and NATO allies are just freeloaders, and when it comes to reaping the rewards, they're not even willing to lift a finger. How can that be? That's just not on. That's why it has now led to Washington seriously considering whether to withdraw from NATO. Over the past 77 years, NATO has actually proven one thing: it possesses remarkable resilience. Although member states often have disagreements on various issues, they are still able to unite when it comes to core interests. The first two times were to confront the Soviet Union, and the third was to safeguard Europe's security. But can NATO weather the storm this time? If the United States were to genuinely withdraw from NATO, could Europe shoulder the responsibility for its own defence? The key issue is whether Europeans, who have enjoyed the comfort of America's protective umbrella for over 70 years, are still willing to truly pay the price for their own security. Friends, what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. To be honest, I'm not optimistic because, as we've discussed in previous episodes, Europe has undergone significant changes. It's no longer the Europe of 1949, rooted in Western civilization and standing alongside America's Christian civilization. Now, Europe is experiencing a massive influx of Muslims. The demographic structure has already undergone drastic changes, and all of this is fundamentally eroding Europe's cohesion. When NATO was founded, there was a very important premise. The entire Western world at that time shared a common sense of identity. There was once a shared belief in civilization, but does Europe still have that now? This reminds me of an earlier episode we did about Trump's Greater North America strategy. In fact, the Trump administration's strategic focus has clearly shifted. America is once again embracing the Monroe Doctrine, turning its gaze from Europe to its own backyard. This isn't just about security, it's also about a deeper cohesion rooted in Christian civilization. If you missed that episode, do go and have a look. This means that America's strategic focus in the future is very likely to shift increasingly towards the Western Hemisphere, building a new alliance system centred on the Americas, rather than maintaining the transatlantic alliance with Europe. So what about Europe's significance in America's global strategy? It's very likely, and in fact it's already visibly happening, that its importance is steadily declining. Therefore, NATO may not actually dissolve, but it's quite possible it will become little more than an empty shell in name only. Such an empty shell, as Trump puts it, is nothing more than a paper tiger. Of course, this story isn't over yet. Rubio has already made it clear that once the war with Iran is over, the United States will reassess its relationship with NATO. This means a showdown between the US and NATO, and that moment may arrive sooner than we expect. We are living in an era of historic upheaval. Many aspects of the world order that were established decades or even centuries ago are now being reshuffled. So subscribe to Zhenguangdian. We'll continue to keep a close eye on these developments. Alright, that's all for today's discussion. Thank you all for watching. Before you go, if you enjoyed my programme and found today's story particularly gripping, don't forget to give me a like. New viewers, you're very welcome to subscribe to Zhenguangdian. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow for more discussion. Don't miss it. Bye bye.